Welcome, everybody, to the Advanced PortGen training on prevailing wage compliance. My name is Tiffany Scroggs, and I am pleased to introduce our expert speaker today, Wendy Ortman. Wendy has been a longtime trainer in partnership with the Washington Apex program, and we are delighted to have her back once again to break down all the prevailing wage things you need to know in order to be successful in public sector contracting. Wendy has been in your shoes. She understands the plight of the small business owner, and we're delighted to have you. Wendy, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Tiffany. I'm excited to be here with you all this morning. I know, prevailing wage compliance maybe is not the hot topic you all would love to start off your morning with, but it should be. So my goal really today is to just give you a broad overview of what you need to know in terms of prevailing wage compliance when working on public works projects in the state of Washington. I am going to give a broad overview. That said, there is a lot of detail that comes with this particular topic. So if there's something that I kind of gloss over and you're like, man, I really need to know more about that, I'll provide some contact information at the end. Absolutely feel free to reach out to me after this presentation if you want to dive into any of the topics in more detail. I would be happy to do that. So this is really just going to give you kind of an idea of what to expect when you're dealing with prevailing wage, some things to think about if you don't have a lot of experience in that sector, or maybe some things even to think about if you have been doing it for a while and you're like, oh man, I didn't even realize this was something I needed to consider. So with that, I'm going to dive right in because we do have a lot to cover. So one of the first things I like to introduce is when should you actually consider prevailing wage? And really, you should be considering it at the point at which you even look to decide whether or not you're going to bid on a project. So during that review phase, you're looking at the proposal, looking at the requirements. You really should be looking at it from the lens of, okay, if this project requires prevailing wage, how do I approach that? And then that's going to feed into your actual bidding and proposal process. So understanding what needs to go into your proposal, how to make sure you're getting compensated for all the additional pieces that come with public works. And then the last sector is if you're awarded a project, understanding what it takes to be considered a responsible contractor and that you are meeting all the prevailing wage compliance pieces that are required of you. So it's really factoring this in from the very beginning will help you approach these projects with a better understanding of what you need to do. Therefore, there's a lot fewer surprises that come at you during the process. It's a lot better to have that understanding up front rather than end up in a project, which does happen where you didn't even realize prevailing wage was a factor. And then you're like, oh, no, now I have to try and backtrack. So definitely be looking for these things throughout your process. So during the bidding and proposal process, this is just kind of a quick overview of looking at navigating prevailing wage requirements and how to build those into your proposal. So understanding, scopes of work that you're going to be performing. You're going to find information on those through the various WAC codes and RCW. Understanding what wage determinations apply to a project. So if it's Washington state only, that's going to come from Washington L&I. If there's federal requirements, you're going to be referencing sam.gov. And then if the project falls under a PLA or CWA, you're also going to be integrating union documents. So the union CBA and Schedule A. And then you also need to look at what type of documentation and reporting would be required. Again, there's an administrative burden with public works. It doesn't make it that scary as long as you know what's coming, but you do want to account for that when you're submitting your proposal and making sure that, your overhead is accommodating the amount of money and time that's going to be spent on meeting the documentation and reporting requirements. And then in terms of the responsible contracting piece, it's really all of the different things that you have to do in terms of administrative work on public works projects. So filing your intents and affidavits, there is a cost associated with those forms. They also take time. Understanding your prevailing wage rates. What do you have to pay your people on these jobs? Understanding how to utilize apprentices and if there are apprentice requirements. Looking at overtime pay, which is very different from private work and even from federal prevailing wage. Washington State's overtime rules are a lot more involved. Understanding fringe benefits, how that factors into the prevailing wage rate that you're going to pay. And then all the certified payroll submission pieces and documents that go with certified payroll. So there's a lot of elements here, again, administratively heavy. It doesn't mean that it's not doable, doesn't mean that there aren't resources. My goal today is to kind of break some of this down and make it hopefully a little bit more manageable and not as scary. As long as you know what's coming, then you can prepare for it. So all things public works and prevailing wage start with Davis-Bacon. I'm not going to go into detail on Davis-Bacon because we're going to be focused primarily on Washington State. But you should know that all state prevailing wage is basically flowed down through the federal law that passed in 1931, which is the Davis-Bacon Act. So this really applies to all your craft employees. So your field labor that are putting work in place on the project in the field are going to be the ones subject to prevailing wage. These pieces don't apply to your administrative staff or like engineers and architects. So any project that has federal funding will adhere to Davis-Bacon. And then states that have prevailing wage, Washington is one of those, they're going to have their own set of prevailing wage requirements that apply when there's state funding. So looking at Washington State prevailing wage, the main RCW that you want to reference for this is 39.12, and this was enacted in 1945. So Washington State's had prevailing wage for quite some time. It is applied liberally. So some states have a threshold, a dollar threshold for you have to, the project has to be a certain value before prevailing wage kicks in. And Washington State, if public dollars are used at all, then prevailing wage kicks in. So there is no dollar threshold. Washington Department of Labor and Industries is kind of the umbrella governing body that's going to enforce this law. That's where you're going to find all of the information you need. So with that, I'm going to kind of introduce you to L&I. So there's a couple different places that you're going to interface with L&I as a contractor doing work in this space. So the L&I website is going to be a great resource. This is where you're going to go to find all of your information on prevailing wage rates, any publications, any determinations the state has made regarding prevailing wage. You'll also find all of your apprenticeship tracking through their website. And then you're going to have your PWI-8 contractor portal. So this is your My L&I account. So that's actually where you're going to be filing your intents and affidavits, filing your certified payroll, and that's going to be within your account, which also houses like your workers' comp and a fair amount of other things. So be familiar with how to navigate Washington L&I's site and where to find things. And then also when it comes to prevailing wage, these are going to be your two main resources. Obviously, there's a lot involved in each of these. So I'm not going to dive into them today. I do occasionally have workshops where we really focus on what all of these pieces are. But RCW 39.12, this is really going to be the series of the Revised Code of Washington that has all the information that you want to see about prevailing wages, how that's applied on public works, how to manage apprentices and apprentice registration, any information on intents and affidavits filing, and then also penalties, like what the penalties are for failure to file. You'll find all that information in the RCW. The WAC is really going to be a bit more focused on some of the broader requirements. So your scope of work descriptions, dives into usual benefits and what qualifies there, your overtime and double time calculations, how that's applied for Washington State, as well as general payroll requirements, and then provides guidance on arbitration and violations and how those are managed. So if you're not familiar with these references, I'd say definitely bookmark those. When you get the slides, there are links. I don't know if that'll come through in the PDF, but again, you can reach out to me and I'm happy to provide those. So if we take that information and look at the bid review, so one of the things that you're going to do using the L&I space, your account, is that you have to make sure that you are properly licensed to do the work you're bidding on. This should be pretty straightforward. If you have a general contractor's license, you're able to pretty much do any of the trades work. If you have a specialty license, then you need to make sure that the work that you're bidding on and that you're going to do falls under that specialty license. Again, this should be pretty straightforward, but I have seen a fair amount of instances where contractors end up doing a scope that they do not have a license for, which can present some unfortunate challenges and a lot of fines and penalties associated with that. You also want to make sure you're properly registered with the state or federal government if you're going to do public works contracting. And then you need to make sure that you also have the necessary workers' comp, insurance, and bonding requirements. So those are really the key things you have to be set up to even start bidding on these projects. So a couple places that you can find information to determine whether or not you're prepared for this. There is a Verify a Contractor tool through LNI's site. You can use this for yourself. I recommend actually going and looking at your profile just so you're aware of what is there and what it says. And then you can also use this tool if you're looking to subcontract. So you as a contractor, if you subcontract out any work, you're responsible for your subcontractors. Risk flows up. So you want to verify that any contractor that you would potentially be working with is also licensed to do that work and has all of the necessary insurance and bonding requirements as well. So that Verify a Contractor tool is great. You search through UBI and you can find out whether or not they're current on their workers' comp, if they've gone through all their training that's required. So to do prevailing wage work, you need to have completed the prevailing wage training through your PWIA account. If you have not done your training, then there's a couple ways that you can do that. So there's online training that you basically do at any time, takes you through a series of workshops. It's pretty straightforward. It's very easy. You can do it in the evenings. If you're more of an in-person and you want to have that dialogue, LNI does offer in-person training. So there's a couple areas there if you go to LNI's site where you can track down that information and find out when those contractor training days are taking place. So moving into the administrative burden. So some things to consider when you're looking at a project are really like what is involved, what are the additional time demands going to be and costs associated with public works jobs. So again, they're administratively heavy. It's important to know that. And you also need to look at who's on your staff, who's going to be managing that piece. You know, if you've got an administrative person, do they have the capacity based on everything else they're doing to take this on? If they don't, then you need to maybe potentially look for third-party resources to help. Or there are times where, quite frankly, you know, maybe it's not the right time and place to tackle one of those projects. And it's best to know and decide that up front rather than get into a project and be in over your head. So definitely involve your internal stakeholders in these discussions. So your internal team, whoever's like within your company, if it's just you and maybe your spouse, or if it's just you have a great conversation with yourself. Do I want to do this? No. Okay. If you've got a pretty decent sized team and you've got, you know, administrative people, you've got your site foreman or supervisors, you've got people who handle just estimating and getting projects in, you know, bring all those people together because it's really going to involve all of them on these public works projects. Identify the labor compliance requirements and look at your team's capacity and decide whether or not that's something that you can handle. So some things to look for labor compliance requirements. Again, huge topic. There's a lot of nuances and details here. So this is just a very broad overview. So the first big thing is looking at the funding sources for the project and what kind of prevailing wage requirements are triggered. So this can be state prevailing wage. You could have federal. There's specific HUD requirements if you're working on a HUD project. There are requirements under the IRA that are completely different because that falls under IRS's jurisdiction. If there's additional agreements like project labor agreements and community workforce agreements, now you have union involvement. So there's a lot of different factors that just determine what prevailing wage you have to pay and then the additional reported requirements that come with those. You can also have additional goals. So there's DEI focus goals, which, you know, we can't really say that anymore. So now they're being called different things. But if there's any types of goals looking at various types of businesses, whether it's just small business, whether there's veteran-owned business, women-owned business, minority-owned business, then you would want to look at those goals. Potentially your business can help meet those, in which case you want to make sure you have the documentation to support that. There's also apprentice utilization goals on a lot of projects that varies based on project size, who the owner is, how they want to tackle that. But you might need to supply apprentices on the project if you can get those, or make sure that you're following good faith effort documentation if it's a scope where apprentices aren't available. And then finally, you get into kind of the meat of the administrative piece, which is your certified payroll. So understanding where that has to be filed. For any state job, it has to be done through Washington L&I. So that's required regardless. But you also see things like LCP trackers, sometimes EMARs. There's additional software out there, and a lot of these projects will require submittal through multiple locations. So just understand, okay, am I going to have to submit my certified payroll in 2 different databases? And that's obviously going to take more time. How do we manage that? And same with your document filing. What all types of documents are you going to have to supply and at what frequency? So for Washington, you always are going to have the requirement to file your intent to pay prevailing wage and then the subsequent affidavit. You might have to provide daily logs on the job, which are going to be submitted daily. Apprenticeship utilization plans. You might have union trust reports if it's a PLA project. Really, the document is going to be very specific to that project's requirements. So look at all these pieces and decide whether or not that's something you feel comfortable tackling. And then once you've kind of gone through that process, how to navigate all of those pieces if you decide you want to bid, and how to integrate those into your proposal. So really this starts getting into like understanding scopes of work and how to take that information and determine what rates of pay you're going to have to pay your field workers. So finding that applicable prevailing wage. And then also, what are going to be the specific certified payroll requirements based on that project? So again, how many different databases? Are there variations in what you have to supply in terms of backup documentation? And then really understanding who all you're going to need to involve in this process. So to start off with, scope of work. So if you go to WAC 296-127, this has all of the different major trade and classifications listed and goes into specific detail on what falls under those. And this can get down to like what hand tool you're using. So definitely become familiar with the scope of work and make sure that when you are going into deciding what prevailing wage you're going to have to pay, that you're looking at the actual work, the physical work that the workers are going to be doing, because that's what determines their classification. It's not their title. It's not just a general like, oh, well, we're just going to call everyone a laborer. That doesn't work. The reason this is so important is that misclassification of workers is illegal. And anyone who has done Washington prevailing wage, I'm sure, is very familiar with knowing just how many classifications you can have for a trade. So if you go look at laborers, in the wage determination for Washington, there's like over 50 different classifications under laborer, right? And some of these are very, very specific, and they have different rates of pay. So you do need to understand exactly how they should be classified, and also understand like what scopes of work are considered covered. So when you see covered work, that means that prevailing wage applies. So there's definitely a lot of detail just in this one piece. I'm really just going to give you a couple ideas on things to watch for commonly misunderstood scopes of work. If you have questions about your specific scope that you've run into, certainly save those for the Q&A or get a hold of me, because there's obviously a lot of detail that I'm kind of glossing over right now. But some commonly misunderstood scopes, and this gets down to the difference oftentimes between federal requirements and state requirements. So trucking and delivery of material, what type of material that is, are they non-standard items? Does it involve equipment? Offsite fabrication is another one. So if you're fabricating material offsite and then it's transported to the job, is that considered covered or not? And again, that varies based on the type of material. Surveying can be very different between federal and state. Equipment rental and repair, and then laborers. I just mentioned laborers because a lot of times that's kind of the default that people will throw in there, but If you actually look at the breakdown of classifications for labor, it's substantial. So you can't just classify people as a laborer. So there's a lot there in terms of scope. So definitely make sure you're getting the correct scope and determining what that should be for your workers. And then you're going to take that scope of work and use that to look at the wage determination and determine what wage rate they have to be paid. So to do that, you're going to go to L&I, and they're going to have published prevailing wages. So these are basically done by every trade, broken down into classification for Washington State. The state determinations are much, much more complex than the federal determinations, if you're familiar with both. And so what this is going to give you is the wage that has to be paid for each trade and specific classification by county. So these rates are determined by the industrial statistician. They're updated every 6 months in the state of Washington, so they have very specific publication dates that they release these. And those are either coming from surveys that they send out, or they now utilize the union CBAs as the reference point for determining the prevailing wage. So when you look up a prevailing wage rate, one of the key pieces you need to know is the effective date for that project. Now, as a subcontractor, or even as the prime contractor, if you are awarded the job, this information is provided to you. So it needs to be provided by the owner. That is not always clear in some of these contracts. So you do need to sometimes do a little bit of research on your own to understand what wages apply. But if you're bidding on a job, you need to know what rates that you need to build into your proposal. So the effective date for a project in determining the prevailing wage will vary based on the project type. Typically, it's the bid due date. So that's kind of the standard for most traditional bid. If you have a job order contract, it's a little bit different. It'll be the issue date of the specific work order. If you have a design build contract, you use the award date instead of the bid date. So there's some nuances there. The prevailing wage handbook for Washington State actually provides a great breakdown for this, if you ever need a reference point. So then once you have your effective date, you're going to go into lni.wa.gov. You're going to search for prevailing wage. There's a handy link there. And it takes you to a page that kind of looks like this. So you've got your journey rates, and then you have your apprentice rates, and those are posted separately. So you're going to input the county that the project is going to take place in. You'll select which trades that you want to get the rates for, and then you put in the effective date. And that's going to allow you to pull the rates for that specific effective date for that county. For the apprentices, those are going to be, again, a separate publication, and that's going to be based on the specific apprentice program that the apprentices fall under. So oftentimes these are union-based programs, and so that's where the rates are pulled from. They're frequently based on a percentage of the journeyman prevailing wage rate. So this just gives you an example of what kind of the apprentice rate breakdown might look like. So it's based on their step level. Keep in mind that apprentice rates are reserved for registered apprentices. So an apprentice has to be registered through the state of Washington in a legitimate apprenticeship program that's recognized by the WSATC in order to be considered an apprentice. So they need to have a certification, says they're part of that program. This is to prevent people from just saying like, oh, I hired someone with no experience and I'm calling them an apprentice, so I get to pay them less. It doesn't work. You have to have a valid apprentice certificate in order to utilize the apprenticeship rates. That apprentice information is done through the ARTS database. So this is the apprenticeship registration and tracking system. Through this, you can search for programs and find what all apprenticeship programs exist in the state of Washington, what their requirements are. You can also search for individual apprentices. You can search by name, but every registered apprentice also is given an ARTS ID, so their apprenticeship registration ID, that you can look them up. And that information will give you like what current step level they're at, what program they're registered in. So definitely make sure if you're utilizing apprentices that you understand how to navigate the ARTS system. This is where you'll pull their apprenticeship certificate, which you're going to have to provide as part of like your certified payroll documentation. So that was a very quick overview of how to find the prevailing wage rates for Washington State. If you have a project that falls under federal requirements, you're going to find those rates through sam.gov. Admittedly, sam.gov is not nearly as user-friendly as Washington L&I's site is, but you can navigate through there. This is going to be through using either a wage determination ID, which is provided to you if you're a subcontractor coming in on a project, or you can search by state and county as well. And so the federal determinations look very different. They're not as nice to read through, but you're going to get that breakdown of a base rate of pay and then a fringe rate of pay. Add those together, you get your total rate. So that's where you would identify the federal prevailing wage rate that would apply to a project. And then the last thing is, if the project falls under a project labor agreement or community workforce agreement, you might also be subject to using signatory union rates. Those rates would be provided to you through like your pre-job conference and getting your final trade assignment. So you would need to be familiar with understanding how to kind of navigate the union CBA language and then their Schedule A's, which are their rate sheets. So this is an example of a union rate sheet. It has basically their different classifications here. You've got taxable net wage. So that's the base rate of pay that the employee would get. And then these are deductions for dues. And then over here is your fringe benefit package. And then you get a total rate. So if you have a project that falls under union requirements, be familiar with how to navigate those union documents to determine the union rate of pay that would be required. And as part of this, there's also factoring in the usual benefits or your fringe benefits. So Washington State's prevailing wage rates are a total rate. So it just gives you a total dollar amount that you have to meet. Not all of that necessarily has to be the employee's base pay. So if you have bona fide fringe benefits, so these can be employer contributions into a health insurance plan, into pension, vacation and holiday pay, apprenticeship training fees are another one that is considered an allowable benefit. So again, these are employer paid. But if you have employer paid benefits, you can take those costs per hour and include those as part of meeting the prevailing wage rate. So they have to be going to bona fide programs in order for those to be legitimate. And there are some very big differences between how fringes are utilized, especially when it comes to overtime between federal and state. So if you do work in both of those and have questions, that'd definitely be something you'd need to identify what those differences are and how that would apply to you. So one of the key differences is that Washington State does not recognize cash fringe. You can pay cash fringe on federal projects, and that doesn't necessarily impact the overtime the way it does in Washington State. So if you are paying what you call cash fringe and it goes directly to the employee as part of their pay, then that's basically considered part of their actual rate of pay. So that matters because if they are working overtime, overtime calculations are based on the actual rate of pay. So you don't get to subtract cash fringe from your overtime calculations. That amount has to be compounded into their overtime. There's also tax implications here. So just know that in Washington State in particular, cash fringe isn't really a thing. You basically just include that as part of their base rate of pay. So understanding the prevailed rate, all of these things, whether it's state, federal, union, you've got a fringe package potentially, and then you've got the amount of pay that goes to the employee, their net pay or their base rate of pay. So if you add those together, the base rate plus your fringe benefits, that equals the total rate. That total rate is what you have to meet the prevailing wage rate of pay that is posted for the job. So some examples here. Glazers, the prevailing wage is $75.91. You can pay that out by paying the employee $54.45 as their base rate of pay, and then $21.46 of bona fide employer paid fringes. So that is going to equal the prevailing wage rate. You've met prevailing wage requirements. You could also pay that as just a straight $75.91 direct to the employee with no bona fide fringes, and you're still meeting prevailing wage. So there's obvious advantages to using usual fringe benefits, as long as they meet the legal requirements, because that results in less payroll taxes. It also can result in a decrease in overtime pay, potentially, but you have to make sure it's being done correctly. So another piece of that, speaking of overtime, is really understanding the overtime and double time requirements on prevailing wage projects. So if you've worked in the private sector or even on federal projects, then it's pretty much just anything over 40 hours in a week triggers overtime. For Washington state prevailing wage, that is absolutely not the case. And I mean, pretty much my entire job as a consultant in this sector and managing compliance on projects is looking at these rules. The number of times I see overtime and double time violations is crazy. So this is definitely an area that's not well understood, especially if you have people coming from the private sector that aren't familiar with these requirements. So within Washington state prevailing wage, there are very specific overtime codes, and they are trade specific. So you have to actually go into L&I, pull up the prevailing wage rate, and then look at these overtime codes to identify how overtime applies based on that specific scope of work. So you can see in this example, we've got our glazers, journey level, they've got the wage rate there, and then you see this holiday code and the overtime code. The holiday code is going to give you a breakdown of what holidays that specific trade recognizes. So not all trades recognize the exact same holidays. So you want to identify that because holiday pay is typically at the double time rate. And then your overtime code, in this example, it's 1Y, is going to provide an overview of how overtime is applied for that trade. So general rule, this not applicable to necessarily every exact instance, but on Washington prevailing wage jobs, there's a daily overtime requirement. So typically, any hours over 8 in a day triggers overtime. It does not matter if that employee makes it 40 hours that week or not. If he works 9 hours Monday, 9 hours Tuesday, and then doesn't work the rest of the week, he's still owed 1 hour of overtime for those 2 days because it was 1 hour over the 8 for that day. So definitely be familiar with the daily overtime requirements. You can also have specific days of the week that may trigger overtime or double time. Saturdays generally considered overtime pay. Some trades don't. So if you have a trade that doesn't have that language, then you could pay Saturday at the straight rate if they haven't met their 40 hours. Sundays are typically double time, but again, not the same for every trade. And you might also see language like on this one, where if the hours are worked outside of a particular time frame, that might trigger overtime requirements as well. So just make sure that you're looking at the trade specific requirements to understand when you're going to need to pay overtime and double time and how to actually apply that, because this becomes critical when you're doing your certified payroll. Some other considerations for when prevailing wage applies. Owner operators is one instance that is kind of unique for Washington. So federal, really the only owner operator they recognize is trucking owner operators. Everyone else, like you could be an owner of whatever trade and they don't consider them an owner operator unless it's a trucking firm. For Washington state, you have to be 30% owner or higher in order to be exempt from paying yourself prevailing wage. If you're a 20% owner of a company, you still have to be paid the prevailing wage rate. If you are over that 30%, you don't have to pay yourself prevailing wage. However, you still have to complete your intent and affidavit, and you still have to file certified payroll. So they still want to see your hours. So there's a special form for owner operator that's only if you have the owner working. If you have the owner and employees working, then you need to fill out the standard payroll form. One other kind of interesting exception is based on supervisors or site foremen. This is based on the amount of time that those individuals spend working on the job site. So if they are strictly there to supervise and they are not picking up tools, not doing any work, they're exempt from prevailing wage. So these are going to be like your salaried employees. However, if they start performing work, then you get into kind of this tricky area where it's like, how much work are they doing? How much of their time is spent on that? And that will start triggering when they have to be paid prevailing wage. So less than 20% of the time, they're clear, you don't have to pay prevailing wage. If they're working more than 20%, but less than 50%, doing hands-on work, putting work in place, then they have to be paid prevailing wage for the time that they're actually spending doing work. But if they work more than 50% of the time, then they need to be paid prevailing wage for all of their time on the job site, including their supervisory time. So just make sure if you have site supervisors or foremen that are sometimes working, but sometimes just supervising, that you're aware of these time requirements. All right. So now we're going to dive into kind of that administrative burden piece. So those were all things like, think of these things as you're putting together a proposal, knowing who needs to get paid prevailing wage, building that into your pricing structure to make sure that you're covering your costs that you're going to be expected to pay. So now we're going to dive into like, here's what happens when you actually are awarded a contract. So this is really when the real work begins, and not just the field work, but also the office work. So before you actually start doing anything in the field, your administrative work is already going to be kicking off. So some of the things that you need to consider: one, who's handling your certified payroll? So if you have an internal person that's going to do that, make sure they are aware that this project is going to require prevailing wage. Make sure they're aware of the requirements, or get them a copy of the contract. Frequently, like the certified payroll folks, and this is typically who I'm working with, they're never given this information. So obviously, like, that's critical for them to do their job and be aware of these requirements that are going to be expected. So it's important that you're actually notifying them of this and including them in this initial conversation. Then you're also going to need to establish who the prevailing wage administrator is. So whether it's the prime contractor or the agency directly, there's always a point person that's involved in all things wage compliance. Get to know who that person is, make them your friend. They are going to be, honestly, like your best resource on these projects, because they are there to help you. They're not there to nitpick. They're not there to, try and find everything you're not doing right. Basically, their whole purpose is to support you in making sure that you're doing things correctly. So if you have questions, if anything's uncertain, that's going to be your primary point of contact. So make sure you track down who that is at the very beginning stages of these projects. And then establish a solid communication channel and workflow to make sure that anyone who's going to touch this project is aware of the requirements. So not just your office staff, if you've got foremen or supervisors, they need to be aware that this is a prevailing wage project. That can change how you have the employees fill out their time cards. It's going to change how they're supervising and understanding if they need to, get apprentices out there, and are those apprentices being supervised appropriately. So there's a lot of nuances. Just make sure that everyone is understanding what these requirements are. And then please, please, please make sure you're getting all of your required paperwork filed before you actually start field work. So your intent that has to be filed through your L&I account has to be done before you start work. Frequently it's not, but legally you're required to have that filed before you actually set foot on site. So make sure that you're getting that done as quick as possible. If there's any other initial reporting, if a project's PLA or CWA, you need to get your pre-job paperwork. That pre-job conference needs to be completely done before you set foot on site. So just make sure you know what those timelines are and that you're meeting them. For your intents and affidavits, so the intent is going to be filed before the job starts. So this has to be filed by basically any contractor who's doing work. And then that is going to flow down to any subcontractors. So the prime contractor files their intent at the very beginning, and then you're going to reference that number as a subcontractor when you file yours. So that information flows down. The affidavit is basically the accompanying form that's filled out once work is complete. And you're basically stating, like, this is who worked on the project, this is how much I paid them, this was our final contract value, and here's anyone that we hired. So both of these forms are critical, but the intent's done before work starts, the affidavit's done after work has been finished. So if you look at the basically the assignment tree that's done through intents and affidavits, the intent in particular. So when you go in and look at a project in L&I's open database, all of that information, how they assign contractors, is based on the intent numbers. So the prime contractor files their initial intent. First tier contractors file theirs directly under that prime contractor. And then if you're a lower tier, you're referencing your hiring contractor when you complete that document. So you want to make sure that you understand who's hiring you and that you're filing that accordingly. If you're a third tier contractor, you should not be indicating the prime contractor as your hiring contractor, because they're not. And they will make you refile that document. There's a $40 fee to file. So, I mean, it's only $40, but when you're a small contractor, you know, those things start to add up. So if you're having to refile this document 3 or 4 times to get it right, it's going to keep costing you $40 every time you do that. So you want to make sure you're getting that correct the first time, just to avoid those refiling fees. And again, anyone who's putting work in place or hiring contractors underneath them has to file these documents. So just be aware of that requirement going in. And then there's a huge, vast number of required supporting documents. These vary by project. Some pretty standard ones are going to be things like your fringe benefit statements. This is just an overview of what fringes you're paying. That allows whoever's doing the compliance review to validate that those are bona fide fringes, and also to review and cross-check against payroll. Authorization letter, so who from your company is authorized to submit payroll. That's pretty common document request. If you're working 410s, need to make sure you have valid 410 agreements in place. Apprenticeship documentation, enrollment forms. If there's different software requirements, you need to be able to provide those. Backup documentation for employee deductions. And then there can be any number of reports or additional forms that have to be filled out. Again, those vary wildly across projects and requirements. So this is not a complete list. Just run through your contract and make sure you understand what your required submittals are. So then when you get to filing certified payroll, again, this is required for basically any public works job. For Washington projects, you're going to have to file through L&I, but you might also be required to file through an additional database. So the who, what, where, when, and why of certified payroll. Who worked? When did they work? Where did they work? What kind of work did they do? And why do you have to do this in the first place? Basically, this is kind of the governing document that people pull reports from, that they can validate, you know, who was on the job site, how much labor you had out there, what were they even doing. So the certified payroll is a critical piece of this, and it encompasses kind of all of these different factors. So before you can even get to that, make sure you have all your employees set up. You need to make sure they're I-9 verified, you have their address. When you're submitting them in these databases, if possible, try and avoid the not specified under your demographic information, because if there are reporting requirements, this matters. If everyone just clicks not specified, you can't effectively pull reports to see if you're meeting these demographic requirements. So I just throw that in there because sometimes like we have to go back and ask people to clarify that. And then make sure you understand their craft classification and then what their fringe benefit package is going to be. Once you have all that information built up in the database, when you start performing work, you're going to submit your certified payroll by weekend date. So you're going to do that through the Washington L&I site and potentially other locations. Weekend date's critical. Once you set that based on your payroll schedule, you cannot change that. If you do, for some reason, change your time frame, so your pay schedule, you have to essentially file an affidavit for that assignment, file a new intent, and start submitting payroll under the new intent with the new schedule. Like you can't just switch your week ending date in the middle of a project. So be aware of that if you were to, you know, maybe change payroll systems and then your weekend date changes. If you are not performing work for certain weeks, or you go, like, let's say you do fencing, you come on at the beginning of the job, you put in the fencing, you're there for maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And then the duration of the job, you don't have anyone on site. And then at the very end, you come back and you take down the fencing. All of that time in between doing work, you have to file what's called a no work payroll. So you're basically just stating we did not have any labor out there, but you're still required to submit that weekly. So you do have to file no work reports for any week where you do not have labor on site. So with your certified payroll, I highly recommend that you're reviewing this before you submit it, just to verify that everything got entered correctly, that you don't have any violations. Because the things that you're going to want to look for, do we have our workers correctly classified? They have the correct trade, the correct classification breakdown. Have we accounted for the state specific overtime and double time requirements? Do we have the correct rate of pay? What are the fringe benefits, and are those broken out? Are they included on there? As you can see in this screenshot example, you do need to have the breakout of your fringe benefits included when you submit certified payroll. And then if there's any like weird deductions, make sure you have an explanation for those and backup documentation. And then the last piece of certified payroll is going to be your statement of compliance. So that statement of compliance is basically where you're affirming, and this is your legal statement saying like this information is true and accurate, and that, to the best of my knowledge, everything here is good, that we've met prevailing wage. You're also going to indicate how you pay out your fringe benefits during this piece. The person who's signing this is somewhat legally responsible for that information. So if you're the one signing payroll, just make sure that you understand this is a valid legal statement and you're on the hook for that information that gets submitted. So then closing out a project, a few things I want to point out. So you need to verify that all of your certified payroll has been submitted. So you have to do this for every single week until you mark a final payroll and you're done. Make sure all of that has been submitted in all the places that it needs to be. Then you're going to start working with whoever your point of contact is on the closeout process. So you'll need to follow up with an affidavit, make sure that gets filed. That affidavit should have a correct summary of your labor, should also have a correct final contract value listed. If you're the prime contractor, you'll have to file a notice of completion once everyone has submitted all of their documents. And then one thing to note is that if you have to do punch list work or warranty work, that is still covered under prevailing wage. You might not be required to file that through all the same locations because the main project has been completed, but that work still must be done paying the prevailing wage rate that applied to the project. All right, so that was a massive blast of information. I know it was a lot. Like I said, I'm hoping to just kind of give you an idea of all of these different pieces to consider, knowing that there's a lot more detail there. But why is all this important? Why is Apex even helping host these webinars? So the reason this is critical is that there are severe repercussions if you are not adhering to these requirements. Basic ones that are not dramatic, or even just like pay holds by the agency or the prime. So if you're considered non-compliant on the project, they can withhold your pay until you achieve voluntary compliance. If you're a small contractor, you know how critical it is to get paid, right? Because you have to pay your people, you have to pay your suppliers. So the last thing you want is to have your pay held because you forgot to submit certified payroll for a month. The bigger problems are that there are fines and penalties that are issued by either the state or DOL for not being in compliance. If they find that things have been done fraudulently, there are even more repercussions. You can have strikes issued. You can be debarred, which means you can no longer work on public works projects for a set period of time. And then finally, there's damage to your reputation. So every prime contractor out there has a list of subcontractors that they're like, I don't know if I want to work with these guys anymore because it was such a hassle the first time, right? You don't want to be on that list. So doing everything you can to maintain compliance is critical because it makes you a lot easier to work with on these projects. And you're also doing everything that you should be in accordance with the state. So some tips for success: read your contract. That is the first thing I can say, and it is shocking to me how much this doesn't happen. If you are signing a contract, you're probably just excited, like, oh, I'm pumped, I've got some work. Make sure you read that entire document and understand what you have signed up for. Read it before you sign it, in fact, and then get clarification where needed. Educate yourself on any of the prevailing wage requirements. Make sure you understand what is expected of you. If you don't understand it, ask someone. Definitely involve all stakeholders within your company. Like your field people and your payroll people and your administrative people need to talk. They really do, in order to make these projects successful. And then be honest with yourself in evaluating your capacity, not just with the technical work that's being done, but also your administrative capacity, and find support where needed. Communication with your hiring contractor, with the agency, with the prime, with whoever you need to, with Apex, talk to people, get help, and definitely utilize all the resources that are available to you, of which there are many. Apex is definitely an awesome resource. Any of the agency or department contacts, like L&I is actually quite helpful if you give them a chance and give them a call. So don't be afraid to talk to them and get clarification. In fact, they want you to do it right. So don't be afraid of any of these people, and utilize all of those resources, and you'll find that prevailing wage really isn't that scary. So with that, blasted through that. I'm sorry I spoke probably 100 words a minute, but we made it through. So if you have questions, phone number right now is the best way to get a hold of me. You can text me at this number as well. Feel free to reach out if you have very specific questions on any of the things I covered. But with that, I'll open it up to any final comments and questions that there are.
That was wonderful, Wendy. Thank you. I'm watching the chat to see if there's any questions or any hands raised with the attendees. And while we're waiting for folks to format those questions, I would like to turn it over to Emily. Emily's with the Port of Seattle, and she's in charge of the advanced PortGen training sessions that we've been holding. And I wanted to give Emily a chance to say hello.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Yeah, I just want to express my appreciation for everybody who came out and attended today. And huge thanks to Wendy for your incredible presentation. It is no easy task to talk for an hour. I mean, clearly you're very passionate and knowledgeable in this. And so we really appreciate you sharing both your enthusiasm and your knowledge with everybody here. And shout out to Tiffany and Leslie from Apex for putting this on. While folks are still thinking about questions, I actually do have one for you, Wendy. Given kind of the vast amount that you shared today, if somebody were just to take 2 or 3 major points away from your presentation about prevailing wage, like what would those be?
All right, my first one is the one I covered at the very end, which is read the contract. Absolutely read your contract. Everything you need to know and what's going to be required of you is in there. Hopefully I've given you some ideas in like what to look for in the contract, but that's the biggest one. Utilizing your resources would be the second. So I've kind of sprinkled them throughout the process. I included some at the very end. I think the misconception a lot of small contractors have, and people new to this space, is that they can't ask questions of people, whether it's your hiring contractor, the prime contractor, the agency. Everyone really wants to see you succeed. Like, we're not setting you up to fail. The system isn't setting you up to fail. Yes, there's a lot there, and there's a lot of hoops to jump through and hurdles, but there is no one that's like, oh man, I'm just going to try and withhold information to see this person fail. It's not accurate. So utilize whatever resources are available to you and ask questions if you do not understand. And then the third one is going to be a bit more specific, but it's probably the area I see the most non-compliance, and that is truly understand, if you're doing Washington state work, what overtime and double time rules are for your scope of work. Like, that is probably the number one thing I see violations for, just because it is so different from federal or private. So definitely focus on that and understand like how overtime and double time implications could impact you. So those are my top 3.
Those are good ones, Wendy. We see our clients get tripped up on those three all the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat unless Leslie, did you have some directly to you that I can't see?
No, I don't see any. I think we're good to go.
Okay, in the chat is the link to the Advanced PortGen training series. This is number 2 of 6 quality trainings. Number 1 is available to watch the recording. That was with Centennial Contractors, who is the job order contractor at the Port of Seattle, talking about you won, now what? So talking about all the submittals that you should expect to have to do once you win a contract, and prevailing wage is one of them, but there's quite a few others. And so I'd encourage you, if you're new to Public Works, to go ahead and check that one out. And then also see what we have coming up. We have indirect cost rates, positioning your firm to work with the port, bonding basics, bonding advanced strategies, and then construction contracting at the port. So you'll all get an invite to our big party of the year in December 16th. It's a celebration of small businesses at the port. And you're welcome to attend that as well. We appreciate your attendance today. Thank you.
I also plugged in Maritime Ministry Day is something we're
perfect.
actually having at the port next week. It's at Pier 69. We've got a number of construction opportunities that we'll be presenting out from our project managers. And so, yeah, I would recommend folks to join that, as well as the construction contracting at the port that Tiffany mentioned. That's going to cover badging and PLAs, as well as apprenticeship, which is some things that Wendy also touched on today. So if you're interested in that, please do join that session as well. That's
Great.
all I've got. Back over
Okay,
to you,
that's wonderful.
Tiffany.
Thank you. All right, everybody take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.